The holographic fleet materialized in a burst of azure light, 12,000 vessels spreading across the tactical display like spilled diamonds. Salendra's fingers moved through the command interface with practiced precision, her violet eyes calculating trajectories and deployment patterns that had earned her 3 consecutive championship victories. The other cadets watched from the amphitheater's shadows, their breath held in anticipation. She had trained for this moment her entire life. The human seated across from her wore the same expression he'd maintained for the past week, curious, almost amused, as if the galaxy's most advanced tactical simulation was an elaborate game. Chad leaned back in his command chair, studying the deployment with what Salendra had come to recognize as his characteristic lack of proper military bearing. Where her people approached warfare as art, sculpture carved from mathematics and physics, he seemed to view it as something else entirely. Something primitive. The competition announcer's voice echoed through Craigsmoor Command's primary arena. Today, the final exercise would determine the new tactical doctrine that would be distributed to every major fleet in the Alliance. Today, everything she had worked toward would culminate in a demonstration of superior strategic thinking. Salendra activated her fleet's defensive formation, watching as her vessels arranged themselves in the elegant spiral pattern that had dominated galactic warfare for 3 centuries. Each ship moved to its assigned position with mechanical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that would funnel enemy forces into predetermined kill zones. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was exactly what any competent strategist would expect. Chad scratched his jaw, glanced at the deployment for perhaps 30 seconds, then began issuing orders. His fleet scattered. Not scattered in the chaotic way of a broken formation, but deliberately, intentionally, like seeds thrown into fertile ground. Salendra frowned, her calculations suddenly uncertain. Ships moving independently, abandoning mutual support, ignoring basic tactical doctrine. She waited for the obvious trap to reveal itself, for the pattern that would make sense of this apparent madness. The pattern never emerged. Instead, Chad's vessels moved like hunters. Not the organized, methodical hunt of a pack, but the random, unpredictable stalking of individual predators. Salendra watched as single ships approached her formation from 17 different vectors, each taking a unique route that defied conventional wisdom. Her defensive calculations, built on the assumption of coordinated enemy movement, began to falter. She adjusted, redirecting squadrons to address the most immediate threats. But as soon as she moved to counter one approach, 3 others materialized from unexpected directions. It was like trying to defend against falling rain by catching individual droplets. Chad tapped his fingers against his console, a rhythmic beat that somehow managed to sound casual despite the intensity of the simulation. He wasn't even looking at the display. Instead, he watched her, those dark eyes studying her reactions with an intensity that made her skin flush warm despite the arena's controlled atmosphere. Salendra had spent years studying human tactical history, preparing for this moment. Their early military doctrines were crude, unsophisticated, relying on brute force rather than elegant strategy. Human commanders were known for their reckless aggression, their willingness to sacrifice efficiency for unpredictability. She had prepared extensively for this barbaric approach to warfare. She had not prepared for it to work. Her formation began to collapse under pressure from too many simultaneous threats. Ships that should have been protecting each other found themselves isolated, cut off from support by the seemingly random enemy movements. The elegant patterns that had served her people for generations became weaknesses, their predictability exploited by an opponent who appeared to follow no patterns at all. Chad leaned forward, finally engaging with the tactical display. His movements were quick, decisive, lacking the careful deliberation that Salendra had been taught was essential to good command. He committed forces without apparent consideration of consequences, launched attacks that should have been suicidal, divided his attention across too many fronts. And won, not through superior firepower or technological advantage, but through something Salendra was beginning to recognize as uniquely human. Where her people sought to minimize variables, humans seemed to thrive in chaos. Where her training emphasized control, Chad's approach embraced unpredictability. The simulation ended with her flagship surrounded, her fleet scattered or destroyed, her carefully constructed strategy reduced to debris floating in holographic space. The arena fell silent, except for the soft hum of the tactical display powering down. Salendra stared at the results, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Chad stood, stretching as if he'd just completed a routine training exercise, rather than demolishing 3 centuries of established tactical doctrine. He moved around the command station toward her, his expression unreadable. "Your formation was beautiful," he said, his voice carrying that strange human accent that turned familiar words into something exotic. Perfect symmetry, optimal firing solutions, textbook deployment. Salendra looked up at him, searching his face for mockery and finding none. That should have been sufficient. In most circumstances, it would be. Chad offered his hand, a human gesture she had learned during their week of preparation. But this isn't most circumstances. She accepted his assistance standing, her own hand smaller and cooler against his warm palm. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her nervous system, a reaction she attributed to the stress of unexpected defeat. "You fight like chaos itself." Chad's laugh was warm, genuine, carrying none of the condescension she might have expected from a victor. "We fight like humans. Sometimes that's the same thing." The observation deck above them erupted in discussion as the Academy's instructors began analyzing the exercise. Salendra could hear fragments of their debate: revolutionary tactics, paradigm shift, fundamental challenge to established doctrine. The words washed over her like distant thunder. Less important than the human standing close enough that she could smell the faint scent of ozone and determination that seemed to follow him everywhere. "I don't understand," she admitted, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. 3 years she had held the tactical championship. 3 years of undefeated competition against the finest strategic minds in the galaxy. Where did I miscalculate? Chad tilted his head, considering her question with the same serious attention he'd given the tactical simulation. You didn't miscalculate. You played by the rules. All the rules. Every deployment optimal, every decision strategically sound. But warfare isn't a mathematics problem. He gestured toward the darkened display where their battle had played out. You fought the simulation, I fought you. The distinction hit her like a physical blow. Salendra had approached the exercise as an abstract puzzle, a test of tactical knowledge and strategic thinking. Chad had treated it as something personal, a contest not between fleet configurations, but between minds, between philosophies, between predator and prey. The realization should have been humbling, even humiliating. Instead, Salendra found herself fascinated. Her people's approach to warfare was sophisticated, elegant, evolved through centuries of refinement and mathematical optimization. Chad's methods were raw, instinctive, built on assumptions about conflict that her civilization had abandoned long ago. And his methods worked. The arena began to empty as other cadets filed out, their conversations animated by what they had witnessed. Salendra remained beside the command station, studying the tactical display that showed the final positions of their forces. Her formation lay in ruins, beautiful patterns reduced to scattered debris. Chad's fleet maintained no formation at all, individual vessels positioned according to some logic she couldn't decipher. "How do you train for chaos?" she asked. Chad leaned against the command console, his casual posture somehow managing not to diminish his presence. You don't train for it, you train in it. We throw our people into situations where everything goes wrong, then teach them to adapt. Salandra nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Her own training had emphasized perfection, the elimination of variables and uncertainties. Human training apparently embraced those same uncertainties, used them as tools rather than obstacles to overcome. The arena's main lights began to dim, leaving only the soft glow of emergency illumination and the residual light from the tactical displays. Soon, they would need to leave, to join the other cadets for the evening briefing, where the day's exercises would be analyzed and critiqued. But Salandra found herself reluctant to end this moment, this conversation that was reshaping her understanding of warfare itself. "Your people," she said, searching for the right words. "You approach conflict differently than the rest of us." Chad's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze distant as if looking beyond the arena walls towards something she couldn't see. "We're predators, Salandra. Not by choice, not by design, but by evolution. For millions of years, survival meant being more dangerous than everything else on our planet." She had read about Earth's evolutionary history, the concept of deathworlds, where life developed under constant threat. But reading about it and witnessing its practical applications were entirely different experiences. "Most species develop intelligence to avoid conflict," Chad continued. "We developed it to win conflicts. There's a difference." Salandra studied his profile in the dim light, noting the sharp angles of his face, the alertness in his posture even at rest. He looked like what he was, a predator adapted for thinking. The combination should have been frightening. Instead, she found it compelling. The arena's environmental systems shifted to night cycle, dropping the temperature and adjusting the lighting to simulate natural darkness. Salandra felt the subtle change as a reminder that they were still aboard a space station, surrounded by the infinite cold of space. But the isolation felt different now, less like confinement and more like intimacy. "Tomorrow we begin the second phase of competition," she said, though the words felt inadequate to address what had passed between them. Chad turned toward her, and in the subdued lighting his eyes appeared almost black. "Second phase will be different. Joint exercises, mixed crews. Alliance doctrine assumes cooperation between species with different tactical philosophies." Salandra felt her pulse quicken, though whether from anticipation of the challenge or proximity to Chad, she couldn't determine. "You think our approaches are compatible?" His smile was slow, predatory, but somehow warm. "I think they could be interesting." The double meaning in his words sent heat through her system, a reaction that had nothing to do with tactical considerations and everything to do with the way he looked at her, as if she were a puzzle worth solving, a challenge worth meeting. The arena's main doors cycled open, admitting the night watch security team for their routine inspection. The moment between them dissolved like mist, professional propriety reasserting itself despite the charged atmosphere that had developed during their conversation. Salandra gathered her equipment, her movements efficient and practiced, but her mind remained focused on Chad's words, on the implications of what she had witnessed during their exercise. Tomorrow's joint exercises would require her to work alongside human tactical methods, to integrate her people's sophisticated strategies with humanity's intuitive chaos. The prospect should have been daunting. Instead, as she walked beside Chad toward the arena's exit, Salandra found herself looking forward to the challenge. For the first time in her career, she was eager to lose control, to step outside the elegant patterns that had defined her training and experience something new, something dangerous, something human. The corridor beyond the arena stretched toward the cadet quarters, illuminated by soft bioluminescent strips that cast everything in shades of blue and silver. Their footsteps echoed softly against the deck plating, a rhythm that somehow felt synchronized despite their different gaits. Tomorrow, Chad said as they reached the junction where their paths would diverge, I'll show you how humans really fight. Salandra paused at her corridor entrance, turning to face him fully. And I'll show you what happens when chaos meets precision. Chad's grin was sharp, anticipatory, carrying promises that had nothing to do with military exercises and everything to do with the current that had been building between them since their first meeting. Good, I wouldn't want it to be boring. He continued down the main corridor toward the human quarters, his gait easy and confident. Salandra watched him go, noting the predatory grace in his movement, the alertness that never quite faded even in moments of apparent relaxation. When he disappeared around the distant corner, she remained standing in the corridor junction, her mind replaying the evening's events. The tactical exercise had demonstrated the effectiveness of human warfare methods, but the conversation afterward had revealed something far more significant. She was beginning to understand that humans approached everything, warfare and conversation and relationships, with the same fundamental philosophy. Embrace the chaos, adapt to the unexpected, turn uncertainty into advantage. Salandra entered her quarters, but sleep remained elusive. Instead, she found herself standing before the viewport that looked out into space, watching the stars that had once seemed like fixed points of navigation. Now they looked different, less like destinations and more like possibilities. Tomorrow's exercises would test more than tactical compatibility between species. They would test whether she could learn to think like a predator, to fight like something evolved for war rather than peace. The prospect no longer seemed threatening. It seemed like evolution. Salandra finally moved away from the viewport as the station's night cycle reached its deepest point. But her last thought before sleep was of dark eyes that looked at warfare like a personal challenge, and the growing suspicion that she wanted to learn everything those eyes could teach her. Everything and more. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new tests of compatibility between strategic thinking and tactical chaos. But tonight, alone in her quarters with the infinite stars beyond her viewport, Salandra admitted something that would have horrified her instructors. She was beginning to think like a human, and she liked it. Outside, the galaxy turned in its ancient patterns, unchanged by the small drama playing out within Craigsmore Command's walls. But inside the academy, something had shifted. Traditional boundaries were dissolving, new alliances forming, predator and strategist discovering unexpected common ground. The war games would continue tomorrow, but the real battle, the one between competing philosophies of conflict and cooperation, had already begun. And Salandra was no longer certain who she wanted to win.